The program listed 11 names of local veterans being honored that morning, printed neatly in the church bulletin my granddaughter handed me as I sat down in row 3 of the community center auditorium. I read through it twice before I understood what I was looking at. My name wasn't on it. My son-in-law, Peter, had helped organize the town's Veterans Day ceremony this year, and somehow, in all the planning, he had simply forgotten to include his own father-in-law. My name is Sergeant First Class Raymond Hutchins, United States Army, retired. I was 71 years old that morning, sitting quietly in a folding chair, holding a bulletin that didn't have my name in it, and I told myself, the way I've told myself plenty of hard things over the years, that it probably wasn't intentional. That didn't stop it from hurting. I need to explain a little about who I was before that morning so you understand what it meant to sit in that chair. I served 22 years in the Army, including 3 tours in Vietnam during the early and mid part of my career, then years afterward training younger soldiers stateside, watching the Army change around me in ways both good and difficult. I came home from Vietnam to a country that, in those years, didn't always know how to receive its veterans well, and I carried some of that experience quietly for a long time afterward, the way a lot of men from my era did. I didn't march in parades, I didn't wear hats with unit insignias, I went to work, raised my daughter, and mostly kept my service to myself, not out of shame, but because for years talking about it simply didn't feel safe in the way it does now. I remember coming home from my second tour, landing at an airport where a small group of protesters had gathered, and learning quickly, the way many of us did, that the safest thing to do with a duffel bag full of memories nobody wanted to hear about was to simply change out of uniform as soon as possible and blend back into civilian life without drawing attention. That habit, built out of necessity in the early 70s, never fully left me. Even decades later, when the country's attitude toward veterans had shifted considerably. Old habits, especially ones built to protect yourself, tend to outlast the circumstances that created them.
My daughter, Karen, married Peter about 15 years ago. Peter is a good man in most ways I can point to. Hardworking, a devoted father to my 2 grandchildren, active in the community in a way I genuinely respect. He got involved with the town's Veterans Day Planning Committee 3 years ago, took real pride in it, and this year had been given the responsibility of coordinating the recognition ceremony, choosing which local veterans would be called up individually to be honored in front of the community. I want to be fair to Peter as I tell this story, because I don't believe, even now, that what happened was born from cruelty. I believe it came from something more common, and in its own way, more uncomfortable to sit with, which is simply that Peter, despite 15 years of family gatherings, Sunday dinners, and holidays together, had never actually asked me many real questions about my service. He knew I was a veteran in the broad, general sense that gets acknowledged with a nod and a thank you for your service at Thanksgiving. He didn't know the specifics, because nobody in my family, including my own daughter, had ever pushed past that general knowledge into anything deeper. The Veterans Day ceremony that year was being held at the community center, a modest but well-attended local event, the kind where the mayor speaks, a color guard presents the flag, and then 11 names get called up front for a round of applause and a small pin. My granddaughter, Sophie, had specifically asked me to come, excited that her father had helped organize it, and I'd agreed happily, looking forward to watching Peter's hard work pay off in front of the community he cared about. I sat in row 3 with Karen and the grandkids, program in my lap, and it was Sophie, 7 years old and reading along with the printed names as the mayor called them one by one, who leaned over and whispered, with the particular bluntness only a child manages, "Grandpa, why isn't your name on here?" I told her, quietly, that I wasn't sure, that maybe there'd been a mix-up. I watched Karen's face when she heard Sophie's question, watched her scan the program herself, watched her expression shift from confusion into something more uncomfortable, as she too realized my name simply wasn't there.
I want to tell you honestly that I didn't plan to make a scene, and I didn't.
I sat quietly through the rest of the ceremony, clapped for each of the 11 names called, genuinely glad for each of those veterans receiving their moment, even as something in my own chest sat heavy and small. What happened next, I want to be clear, wasn't something I orchestrated. I hadn't told anyone in that room who I was beyond Karen's father. I hadn't mentioned my service history to organizers or announced myself to anyone. What happened was entirely the result of one person in that audience happening to recognize me, independent of anything my own family had or hadn't said. 2 rows behind me sat a man I hadn't noticed until the ceremony was nearly finished, a retired 2-star general named Walter Briggs, who, as it turned out, had moved to our town just 18 months earlier to be near his own grandchildren, and whose path and mine had crossed decades earlier during a training assignment I'd nearly forgotten about myself, a period where I'd served as a senior non-commissioned officer, helping develop a new training program that a much younger Lieutenant Briggs had gone through as part of his own early career development. I hadn't recognized him at all when we'd first taken our seats that morning. Decades and a considerable amount of gray hair separating the young lieutenant I vaguely remembered from the composed, silver-haired man sitting quietly 2 rows back. He apparently had recognized me almost immediately, something he later told me had nagged at him through most of the ceremony, a persistent, half-formed memory he couldn't quite place until the moment the mayor mentioned, in passing, some general biographical details about the 11 veterans being honored, details that happened to jog loose the specific memory of a training program from nearly 40 years earlier.
As the ceremony wound towards its close, General Briggs stood up from his seat, which drew a small ripple of attention simply because standing during the closing remarks was unusual enough to notice. He made his way down the row, apologized quietly to the people he needed to step past, and walked directly towards where I was sitting. He stopped in front of me, came to a full, formal position, and rendered a proper salute, the kind reserved for specific respect between service members, not the casual nod most civilians associate with military courtesy. The entire section around us went quiet, confused murmurs rippling outward as people tried to understand what they were witnessing. I stood, somewhat stunned myself, and returned the salute out of pure muscle memory built over more than 2 decades of service. General Briggs then said, loudly enough for the immediate rows around us to hear clearly, that he owed a portion of his own career to the training I had helped develop decades earlier, training that had, in his words, directly influenced how an entire generation of young officers learned to lead under pressure. The mayor, still at the podium, noticed the commotion and paused the closing remarks. General Briggs, without missing a beat, asked if you might have a brief moment and proceeded to explain, in front of the entire community center, who I was, what I'd done, and the fact that somehow, in all the planning for that day's ceremony, my own name had been left off the list of veterans being honored. I want to describe what that moment felt like, because it wasn't triumphant in the way you might expect. It was deeply uncomfortable, honestly, being suddenly and publicly recognized in a room full of people, including my own family, who hadn't known enough to include me in the first place. I felt exposed more than vindicated, the sudden attention landing somewhere complicated in my chest.
Peter, standing near the front where he'd been helping coordinate the event, went visibly pale. Karen, beside me, had her hand over her mouth. Sophie tugged my sleeve and asked, in the loud whisper only children manage, whether I was, actually famous. The mayor, recovering quickly, insisted I come up front, and the community, entirely on their own initiative, gave me an ovation considerably longer and warmer than the one any of the 11 originally listed veterans had received, which, I'll admit, felt like an uncomfortable kind of consolation prize rather than something I'd actually wanted. After the ceremony, Peter found me near the refreshment table, clearly shaken, and apologized in a way that felt genuine rather than performed, explaining that when he'd built the list, he'd worked primarily off the local VFW's membership roster, and because I'd never joined the VFW, never marched in a parade, never mentioned specific details of my service beyond the general fact of having served, my name simply hadn't crossed his desk during the planning process. He kept apologizing, cycling through variations of the same explanation, clearly needing me to understand it hadn't been deliberate, and at some point I put my hand on his shoulder and told him I believed him, that I could see plainly how it happened, and that continuing to apologize wasn't going to undo the moment any faster than simply sitting with the discomfort of it together. He seemed to need permission to stop apologizing almost as much as he'd needed to apologize in the first place. I told him I understood how it happened, and I meant it, though understanding didn't erase the sting of watching my own family's silence get corrected, publicly, by a stranger from 2 rows back, rather than by anyone who actually knew me. Karen and I had a longer conversation about it that evening after the grandkids had gone to bed. She admitted, honestly, that she'd never really pushed me for details over the years, partly out of respect for what she sensed was a difficult subject, partly, she admitted, out of her own discomfort imagining her father in situations she couldn't picture and didn't want to picture. She said watching General Briggs salute me had been like meeting a version of her own father she'd somehow managed to avoid getting to know for her entire adult life. She told me, sitting across from me at the kitchen table that night, that she remembered, as a little girl, occasionally overhearing me talk in my sleep, words and fragments she never fully understood and was too frightened to ask about the next morning, and that somewhere along the way, that childhood fear had calcified into an unspoken family rule that we simply didn't discuss those years directly. Hearing her describe it that way helped me understand, for the first time, that the silence between us hadn't been entirely one-sided, that she'd built her own careful avoidance around the same subject I'd been quietly protecting. I told her the truth, which is that I hadn't made it easy for her either, that my own generation of veterans often built quiet walls around those years without meaning to shut anyone out specifically, and that the responsibility for the silence between us belonged to both of us, not simply to her or to Peter's oversight. In the months since, things have shifted in small, meaningful ways. Peter asked if I'd be willing to sit down with him properly, to actually record some of my history for the town's Veterans Archive project, and I agreed, slowly working through some of what I'd kept quiet for decades. Sophie now asks me questions regularly, the unfiltered curiosity of a child who'd witnessed something remarkable and wanted to understand it fully. Next year's Veterans Day program, Peter has already told me, will include my name near the top of the list, not as an afterthought, but because he's finally taking the time to actually know the man he'd been calling father-in-law for 15 years. I've even started, slowly, joining a few of the local veterans' coffee mornings I'd avoided for years, sitting with men who understand certain silences without needing them explained. If you've ever sat quietly in a room while people who love you overlooked something significant about who you are, not out of malice but simply because the asking never happened, I hope you hear this. Recognition that comes from a stranger who happened to know better can feel like both a gift and a quiet indictment at the same time, but sometimes that uncomfortable public moment is exactly what finally opens the door your own family needed to walk through, however many years too late it arrives.